My name is Robert Mackenzie. I am 43 years old, and I work as a logging supervisor for Great Lakes Timber Company, managing timber harvesting operations throughout the Hiawatha National Forest in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you are watching from, please. I've been working logging operations for 19 years, spending the last 11 in the Upper Peninsula, where we harvest timber from federal lands under strict environmental guidelines that protect wildlife habitat while allowing sustainable forest management. The Hiawatha National Forest covers nearly 1 million acres of pristine wilderness, much of it rarely visited by humans outside the timber industry. This happened last September during a routine timber survey in a remote section of the forest about 25 miles south of Munising. I was conducting preliminary assessment of a timber sale area, marking trees for harvest and documenting wildlife sign to ensure compliance with environmental protection requirements. The work requires spending several days alone in the wilderness, camping in areas accessible only by logging roads, and traveling on foot through dense forest to assess timber quality and environmental impacts. It is demanding work in country where the nearest help can be hours away. I'd been working in the area for 3 days, documenting a section of mature hardwood forest that showed excellent potential for selective harvesting. The forest was typical Upper Peninsula wilderness, dense stands of maple, oak, and birch, with thick understory that limits visibility to maybe 50 yards in most areas. On the third evening, while setting up camp near a small creek that would provide water for cooking and cleaning, I heard something moving through the forest that immediately got my attention. Heavy footsteps, clearly bipedal, moving with purpose through terrain that would challenge even experienced hikers. The footsteps were too heavy and too rhythmic to be a bear, which moves with a different gait pattern, and too large to be a deer or other common forest animal. Most concerning was that whatever was making the sounds seemed to be circling my camp area, maintaining a consistent distance while staying hidden in the dense forest. Around 8 p.m., as darkness was settling over the forest, I heard vocalizations that didn't match any wildlife I knew in the region. Deep, guttural sounds that seemed part howl and part human vocalization, coming from multiple directions around my camp position. I remained by my campfire following protocols for dangerous wildlife encounters, but this situation was unlike anything covered in safety training. The vocalizations suggested intelligence and communication rather than random animal sounds, and they seemed to be getting closer to my position. Around 9 p.m., while I was preparing to move my camp to a more defensible position, something emerged from the forest at the edge of my firelight. What I saw challenged everything I understood about wildlife in the Upper Peninsula. The creature was enormous, easily 7 feet tall, built like a powerful human but covered in dark brown fur or hair. The head was wrong, elongated like a wolf or dog, with ears that stood erect and eyes that reflected my firelight like an animal's. But it walked upright on 2 legs with perfect balance and obvious intelligence. Most disturbing was that it showed no fear of my fire or my presence. It approached to within 20 feet of my camp and stood there studying me with obvious curiosity, tilting its head in a way that suggested it was trying to understand what I was and what I was doing in its territory. The creature remained at the edge of my firelight for maybe 5 minutes, during which time I remained completely motionless, unsure how to respond to an encounter with something that appeared to be part human and part wolf. Then it made a sound, a low rumbling that seemed part growl and part speech. After making the vocalization, the creature turned and walked back into the forest with the fluid grace of something perfectly adapted to wilderness travel. But I could hear it moving through the trees around my camp, circling my position while staying just beyond the reach of my firelight. I spent the night awake, maintaining my fire and listening to sounds of movement in the surrounding forest. The creature seemed to maintain surveillance of my camp throughout the night, occasionally making vocalizations that were answered by similar sounds from other locations in the forest. At dawn, I examined the area where the creature had stood and found clear tracks in the soft earth near the creek. The prints were roughly human-shaped but much larger, maybe 14 inches long, with claw marks that showed the creature had retractable claws like a dog or wolf. I documented the tracks with photographs and GPS coordinates, then packed my equipment and left the area immediately, following protocols for encounters with dangerous or unknown wildlife. When I reached areas with cell phone service, I called Great Lakes Timber to report a potentially dangerous wildlife situation. My supervisor listened to my account with obvious concern and advised me to file a detailed incident report while avoiding specific descriptions that might attract unwanted attention from media or animal rights groups. He also mentioned that other logging crews had reported similar encounters in remote areas of the forest. 3 days later, I was contacted by a man who identified himself as Dr. William Strand from Michigan Technological University, requesting an interview about my wildlife encounter for research purposes. He arrived with recording equipment and spent several hours documenting my observations. Dr. Strand explained that encounters with unknown canine species had been reported in the Upper Peninsula for over a century, with consistent descriptions of large bipedal creatures that showed characteristics of both wolves and humans. He was conducting research into possible hybrid species or unknown subspecies that might exist in the region's vast wilderness areas. He also mentioned that similar creatures had been reported by Native American communities in the region for generations, known by various names in Ojibwe languages that translated roughly to wolf, man, or dog spirit. According to traditional knowledge, these beings were intelligent and generally avoided human contact, but could be territorial about their home ranges. I spoke with Ojibwe elders in the nearby community of Munising, seeking traditional perspective on what I'd encountered. They described traditional knowledge about beings they call Maingen Winini, entities that were created when the boundary between human and wolf spirits became blurred during ancient times. According to traditional teachings, these beings were intelligent and powerful, possessing characteristics of both humans and wolves. They were described as guardians of the deep forest, who occasionally interacted with humans, but preferred to remain hidden and undisturbed in their wilderness territories. I continue working logging operations in the Upper Peninsula, but I am much more cautious now about working alone in remote areas, particularly during dawn and dusk hours when wildlife is most active. When I hear unusual vocalizations or find tracks that don't match known species, I document everything while maintaining respectful distance from whatever might have made them. My name is Thomas Brightwater. I am 38 years old, and I work as a commercial diver for Superior Marine Services, conducting underwater inspections, salvage operations, and maintenance work throughout Lake Superior, focusing on the waters around Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I've been working commercial diving for 14 years, spending the last 8 based out of Grand Portage, covering dive operations from Duluth to Sault Ste. Marie. Lake Superior is one of the most challenging diving environments in the world, with water temperatures that rarely exceed 40 degrees and visibility that can change from excellent to 0 in minutes. This happened last October during a routine inspection dive on the wreck of the SS Kamloops, a cargo vessel that sank in 1927 near Isle Royale and has become one of Lake Superior's most famous shipwrecks. The dive was part of a historical preservation project documenting the condition of significant wrecks in the lake. The Kamloops lies in 260 feet of water, requiring technical diving skills and specialized equipment to reach safely. The wreck is remarkably well preserved due to Lake Superior's cold water and low oxygen levels, making it an important historical site, but also a challenging and potentially dangerous diving environment. I was working with a dive partner, following standard protocols for deep technical dives, using mixed gas breathing systems and extensive safety equipment. The dive was planned as a 40-minute bottom time to photograph and document the wreck's current condition for preservation authorities. The descent went normally, and we reached the wreck without problems. The Kamloops sits upright on the bottom, largely intact, despite nearly a century underwater. The wheelhouse, cargo holds, and crew quarters are all accessible to divers, though penetration requires extreme caution due to the risk of entanglement or disorientation. About 20 minutes into the dive, while photographing the ship's wheelhouse, I noticed something that immediately changed my understanding of what we were dealing with down there. Moving through the water near the ship's stern was a figure that appeared to be human, but wrong in ways that made it clearly not a living person. The figure was dressed in what appeared to be 1920s era work clothes, heavy jacket, wool cap, boots that were consistent with merchant marine uniforms from the period when the ship sank. But the figure was moving through the water without breathing apparatus, showing no concern for the deadly cold and pressure that would kill any unprotected human in minutes. Most disturbing was that the figure seemed to be aware of our presence and was deliberately staying just beyond clear identification range. When I tried to approach for a better look, the figure would move away, maintaining a consistent distance while continuing to observe our diving activities. I signaled my dive partner, who confirmed that he was also seeing the figure near the wreck. We attempted to approach together following standard protocols for investigating unusual underwater encounters, but the figure continued to evade our efforts while maintaining its observation of our work. Around 35 minutes into the dive, as we were preparing to begin our ascent, the figure approached much closer, allowing us to see details that challenged everything we understood about underwater survival. The face was clearly human, but showed the pale, preserved appearance of someone who had been underwater for an extended period. Most remarkably, the figure appeared to be trying to communicate with us, making gestures toward specific areas of the wreck and pointing toward sections of the ship that we hadn't yet explored. The communication seemed purposeful and intelligent, suggesting the figure had knowledge about the wreck that it wanted to share. We followed the figure's gestures toward a section of the cargo hold that our dive plan hadn't included and discovered areas of structural damage that weren't documented in historical records of the wreck. The figure continued to point out specific features and damage patterns, acting as a guide to parts of the ship that held special significance. As our bottom time expired and we began our ascent, the figure remained near the wreck, watching our departure, but making no attempt to follow us toward the surface. During our decompression stops, we could see it moving around the ship, continuing activities that suggested ongoing connection to the vessel. When we reached the surface and returned to our dive boat, I immediately documented the encounter with detailed notes and sketches of what we'd observed. My dive partner confirmed all the details of our interaction with the figure, and we both agreed that we'd witnessed something that couldn't be explained through normal understanding of underwater environments. That evening, I reported the incident to Superior Marine Services as an unusual underwater encounter that required documentation for safety purposes. But I was also contacted by a local historian named Margaret Johansson, who specialized in Lake Superior maritime history and had heard about unusual experiences near shipwreck sites. Margaret explained that encounters with apparitions of drowned sailors had been reported by divers throughout Lake Superior for decades, particularly at wreck sites where crews had been lost during sinking incidents. The Kamloops was known as one of the most active sites for such encounters. She described historical accounts of the ship's final voyage and the circumstances of its sinking during a November storm in 1927. The entire crew of 22 men had been lost when the ship went down, and several bodies had never been recovered despite extensive search efforts. According to maritime historians and local diving communities, the spirits of lost sailors sometimes appeared to divers visiting their wrecks, acting as guardians of the sites, and occasionally providing assistance or information about the ships and their final voyages. Margaret also mentioned that similar encounters had been reported at other significant shipwreck sites throughout Lake Superior, including the Edmund Fitzgerald and numerous other vessels lost during the lake's long history of maritime disasters. I spoke with Ojibwe elders in the Grand Portage area, seeking traditional perspective on what we'd encountered underwater. They described traditional knowledge about water spirits or drowned ones, entities that existed in the boundary between life and death in the waters of Gichigami Lake Superior. According to traditional teachings, those who died in the lake sometimes remained connected to the places where they'd lost their lives, particularly if their bodies weren't properly recovered for burial. These spirits were generally benevolent, but were bound to their underwater locations until their stories were properly told and their sacrifices acknowledged. I continue working commercial diving in Lake Superior, but I am much more respectful now of the historical significance of wreck sites and the possibility that they might be inhabited by spirits of those who died there. When I encounter unusual underwater phenomena, or feel the presence of unseen observers during wreck dives, I approach my work with greater awareness that these sites are more than historical artifacts. They're also memorials to lives lost in one of the world's most dangerous bodies of water. My name is Daniel Copperfield. I am 51 years old, and I work as a historical preservation specialist for the Michigan State Historic Preservation Office, documenting and maintaining abandoned mining sites and ghost towns throughout the Upper Peninsula's former iron mining region. I've been working historical preservation for 22 years, spending the last 13 focused on mining heritage sites in the Keweenaw Peninsula and Iron Range areas, where over a century of mining operations left behind thousands of abandoned structures, mine shafts, and entire communities. This happened last November while I was conducting a survey of buildings in the abandoned town of Calumet, once the center of Michigan's copper mining industry, but now largely deserted, except for a few remaining residents and historical preservation efforts. The work involves photographing and documenting historical structures, assessing their condition for preservation priority, and researching the history of buildings and communities that played important roles in Michigan's mining heritage. Much of this work requires spending time alone in buildings that have been abandoned for decades. I was surveying the old Calumet and Hecla Mining Company office building, a massive brick structure that once housed the administrative headquarters for one of the world's largest copper mining operations. The building has been empty since the mines closed in the 1960s, but it is structurally sound and contains important historical artifacts. The survey work requires examining every room and floor of the building, documenting architectural details, and assessing preservation needs. It is painstaking work that often takes several days to complete for large structures, like the mining company headquarters. On the second day of the survey, while photographing offices on the third floor that once housed mining engineers and supervisors, I began hearing sounds from other parts of the building that suggested I wasn't alone. Footsteps, voices, and what sounded like normal office activities coming from floors I'd already confirmed were empty. The sounds were consistent with a busy office environment. People walking between rooms, papers being shuffled, muffled conversations through walls. But when I investigated the sources of these sounds, I found empty rooms with no evidence that anyone else was in the building. Around noon, while documenting the main administrative office that had belonged to the mining superintendent, I heard a voice calling my name from somewhere in the building. The voice was clear and distinct, clearly addressing me specifically, but when I searched the entire building, I found no one else present. The voice continued calling periodically throughout the afternoon, always from areas of the building where I wasn't currently working. The calls seemed intended to get my attention or guide me to specific locations within the building, but I could never locate the source. Around 3 p.m., while photographing mining records in a storage room, I encountered something that challenged everything I understood about abandoned buildings and historical preservation work. Standing in the doorway of the storage room was a man dressed in 1920s era business clothes, wool suit, vest, pocket watch, consistent with mining company executives from the peak period of operations. The figure was clearly aware of my presence and seemed interested in my documentation work, gesturing toward specific filing cabinets and record collections, as if directing my attention to particularly important historical materials. Most remarkably, the figure appeared solid and real, not transparent or ghost-like as I might have expected. The figure remained visible for several minutes, during which time I continued my work while observing its behavior. It moved around the storage room with obvious familiarity, pointing out records and documents that it seemed to consider especially significant for historical preservation. When I tried to speak to the figure, it showed clear awareness of my communication attempts, but didn't respond verbally. Instead, it continued to gesture toward specific areas of the room and specific collections of documents, as if trying to ensure that important historical information received proper attention. After maybe 10 minutes, the figure walked toward the storage room door and disappeared, simply ceasing to exist as it crossed the threshold. But the sounds of office activity continued throughout the building, suggesting that other similar figures might be present in areas I couldn't see. For the remainder of that day, and through the following morning, I continued to encounter the figure and others like it in various parts of the building. They appeared to be going about normal office activities, as if the mining company was still in operation, but they showed awareness of my presence and seemed interested in my preservation work. I spoke with Finnish-American community elders in the Calumet area, whose families had immigrated to work in the copper mines, and who maintained traditional knowledge about relationships between the living and the dead in mining communities. They described traditional beliefs about the spirits of those who had died in mining accidents, or who had devoted their lives to dangerous underground work. According to these traditions, such spirits often remained connected to the places where they'd worked, particularly when those places contained the legacy of their life's work. I continue working historical preservation in Michigan's mining regions, but I am much more aware now that these sites might be inhabited by the spirits of those who lived and worked there. When I encounter unusual phenomena in abandoned mining buildings, I approach my work with greater respect for the possibility that former residents and workers maintain an ongoing interest in seeing their heritage properly preserved and honored.